welcome to lesson 7 of the video lessons on Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia. We're today looking at a more content-focused area. Pretty much every one of the other lessons we do about this why did Hitler come to power question will be a factor, a paragraph or two in itself. There's very rarely going to be a presidential government paragraph. However, presidential government describes the historical period between 1930 and 1932, where very often a lot of the other factors happen. So this is more of a chronology, more of the story of what happens after the fall of the Müller government up until Hitler getting into power, which is essential to know because it will be used as evidence to prove other points. So while I'll be making offhand references to other paragraphs and other arguments, I wouldn't worry too much about getting the overall arguments or thinking that this is a paragraph what one should do on it. So context. As we know from previous lessons, the Weimar democratic system was very flawed. Not necessarily because of proportional representation. The things which made proportional representation bad were outside of that due to political weakness and economic weakness. But for whatever reason, there was a series of weak coalitions who ran Germany in the 1920s. By the Great Depression, something we looked at last lesson, there is the establishment of the so-called Grand Coalition. This is a coalition across parties covering pretty much every democratic party still interested in running the country. This includes the SPD. Now, if you remember, the SPD were very important in the early years, but particularly after the various crises of the first couple of years of Weimar democracy, they tended to take an opposition role because they lost a lot of support for the compromises they had to make while in government between 1919 and 1923. But the SPD come back in this time of emergency, faced with this economic problems, this economic crisis, and this so-called Grand Coalition is designed to deal with this crisis. Now, as you would expect, the weaknesses, the difficulties, the hostilities between the parties don't get any better in this period. And in reality, the incompetence, or if not incompetence, the inertia of the political system continues, and so decisions are still not made because they cannot be, for the same reason, they cannot be coalition, cannot be votes made on them because there's not a consensus amongst the parties, and the coalition looks always like it's on the edge of breaking up at any point, as you have several parties with very different worldviews, very different political views, all trying to pretend to get on. At a certain point, they do not have a majority of a vote, particularly around, in this case, the budgetary area. They ask Paul von Hindenburg, the president, to use Article 48 to push through this bill. If you remember, Article 48, which will play a big role going forward, is the emergency powers decree, the power to decree laws in an emergency without having to get the requisite majority in the Reichstag. This can be overturned with 2/3 of the Reichstag, but generally doesn't happen. Hindenburg refuses, partly, or at least historians suspect, because he refuses to prop up a government with the SPD in it. He sees that as giving legitimacy to the SPD, a socialist force he fundamentally is against. And so the government falls, and the Grand Coalition falls. And the problem is, that was the only chance of getting a majority, because the rise on the extreme parties on the left and the right, who won't join any coalition, means that the options of anyone who wants to form a democratic majority are very limited. And so in reality, after a little bit of dashing about and trying to make new alliances, it's quite clear that no party will be able to get the over 51% of support through either voting or through the coalition building. So we now enter the period of presidential government, as it's known. Presidential government is where we do have a Reichstag, we do have individuals in government in Reichstag, but they never have a majority of the seats in the Reichstag, which means that in theory they can't pass any laws, which means that they are dependent on the use of Article 48, the power to decree laws without the Reichstag, in order to get anything done. This is called presidential government, therefore, that although we have chancellors and although we have parties, they rise and fall and they decide what they do and they get stuff passed largely on the will of the president, in this case Hindenburg. If Hindenburg doesn't like you, as we shall see, he stops giving you Article 48 and you cease to be relevant and cease to exist, as we shall see with our first Chancellor in particular. So throughout this period, it's well worth bearing in mind that a lot of the decisions made are actually as much to blame or much to do with Hindenburg, either because he is the one passing the law, the Article 48 decree and wants it, or that he is acceding to the demands. He's allowing these laws to go through. So he almost acts as a filter. So any law that is made in this period, although we can blame the chancellors, we should always bear in mind that this does go with Hindenburg's permission, and Hindenburg certainly just doesn't give his permission to anything that is proposed. So let's look to our first chancellor. This is Bruning. Now, of all the chancellors, he is the most sympathetic. He isn't fundamentally evil. He isn't fundamentally trying to seize power for himself. And ultimately, it's quite clear that although he despairs at democracy, and he certainly doesn't enjoy democracy, particularly when it returns Marxists and socialists to his party, he fundamentally subscribes to the idea of the democracy. He sees this as a temporary emergency that he will try and deal with. Now, he is a Centre Party representative, but it's well worth noting that since 1919, when the Centre Party was very much socially conservative but economically liberal, the Centre Party, in reaction to the crises of the 1920s, in reaction particularly to the cultural changes in the 1920s, have become increasingly right-wing. Not as much as the DMVP and not to the point of anti-democracy, but there is now a wing of the Centre Party which is more hostile to democracy, and they are as a group far more conservative, far less likely to make alliances with, say, the SPD like their 1920 brothers did. So Bruning will rule completely dependent on Hindenburg and using the Article of 48 powers. That is very important for what we looked at. So our argument at Bruning, as we shall see, isn't that he deliberately destroyed democracy, unlike the other two. Our argument is going to be that his incompetence, his inability to deal with the crises through 1930 to 32, his exacerbation of the crisis, in turn led to an increased support for authoritarianism, B, the rise of the Nazis, C, circumstances which leads and encourages, so for example the rise and violence of communism that we looked at last time, that leads to support for the Nazis and the end of the regime. So our argument is Bruning is perhaps an indirect force rather than a direct force, because at no point is there really the evidence that he fundamentally wants to see the system burn, unlike, let's say, von Papen. So he goes along the government, as mentioned. He does not succeed solving the problems of the government. Now, you have in your books, and you can get easy facts to prove it, but essentially unemployment continues to grow, poverty continues to grow, trade continues to decline. He becomes known as the Hunger Chancellor because he decides to approach the Depression in a deflationary way. What that means is, as there is an economic crisis, the government has historically been spending more than it gets in tax. When you have a depression and there are loads of businesses failing, people are getting paid less, not getting paid, taxes go down, which means there's an even bigger gap, and we call that a balance of payment deficit. His approach is to create cuts, firing bunches of civil servants, for example, as we shall see, causing a lot of malaise amongst the middle classes and lower middle classes, many of whom will then vote for the Nazis. He will lead to some decreases in welfare. Now, this is known as deflationary policy because what it will do is it means there's fewer people with money in their pocket. That means there's less demand. Now, people will criticise him because this is the exact opposite of what we need to do in a crisis. If there's an economic crisis, what you really want to do is get people spending money so that people have jobs, that because there is demand for products from the factories they work at, and then because people pay jobs, then they will go out themselves and buy stuff, and that will lead to more demand. But in his defence, this was the conventional orthodoxy of the time. This was the orthodox economics. He was not any different to what the policy of Hoover was in America, or that the policy of the Labour Ramsay MacDonald right at the same time in Britain. So, although yes, he is a Hunger Chancellor and certainly doesn't help, we shouldn't be too harsh on him because he is just following conventional wisdom. Regardless, his regime becomes deeply unpopular, and there's very little sign that what he is doing is actually helping fix the depression in any way, shape, or form. There is a debate if you can fix the depression, or you have to depend on international trade. That is a separate debate. So, you can in your own time look at the statistics, but just find a few statistics showing that the economy is not recovering. He, however, loses confidence of Schleicher and Hindenburg. Now, Schleicher is a man we haven't mentioned so far. Schleicher isn't necessarily what we'll describe as Minister of War, okay, a political point of view, but he is a senior general, one who is very, 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 very important within the regime. He has the ear of Hindenburg. He meets Hindenburg very often. Hindenburg, if you remember, is an ex-Prussian officer, or German officer, and Hindenburg therefore is more willing to listen to officers or Prussians, because they're the people he surrounds himself with, than anyone else. And Schleicher is this intriguing, behind-the-scenes, backstabbing figure who sees himself as a power behind the throne, the fixer. Well, Schleicher looks at the increasing failure of Bruning to decrease the joblessness rate, and the increase in violence between communists and Nazis, and says that what we need is a more authoritarian chancellor. A chancellor who will A, deal with these communists, B, make deals with Hitler, and C, will force the jobless rate down by some means. Schleicher doesn't matter so much, though, because in reality it's Hindenburg who has the power. Now, Hindenburg, in theory, can't easily fire Bruning, so he can't say you're fired and get someone else. He can dissolve the Reichstag and call new elections, and therefore the biggest party will have technically the best opportunity to make the new chancellor. But the centre party often gets reliable votes, so in reality that won't necessarily work. But what he can do is withdraw Article 48. Article 48, if you remember, is the only way you get stuff put through the Reichstag. You have roughly 15 to 20% of Marxists on the left voting no to everything. You have about 18, and then as time goes on, up to 30% of Nazis voting no to everything. And then you had a DMVP who largely vote no to anything. Then you have other parties who vote no to everything. And therefore what we see is a fundamental weakness in the amount of percentage of people who are actually going to vote for any laws. So, based on that, the only way you can get laws passed is not for this majority, because structurally opposition parties mean you can't pass anything. And even if you had 51%, the parties which are pro-democracy and that do want to get stuff done are so divided and so different ideology, it's very difficult to get anything but the most lamest bill through. And if you're thinking about dealing with depression, often requires very extreme legislation. So there's no way you're going to get the SPD on one side and the state party, the DVP's, the DDP's evolution, or the DVP to support it. Therefore, the only way you get stuff passed is Article 48. As soon as, therefore, Hindenburg does not like you, he withdraws Article 48. He does not let you do Article 48, and you become what is known as a lame duck. It means you cannot pass anything because you have no respect in the legislature. Then you are forced, essentially, to resign. So, what does Bruning do to upset Hindenburg? Number one, Hindenburg demands that Bruning talks to the DMVP and the Nazis to allow Hindenburg to run as president beyond 1932. Remember, he was elected in 1925, so 1932 is 7 years later, without much of a race. Hindenburg is 85. He's a bit too old for it. Hitler declines. And he therefore has to fight an election, which is a bit of an effort against Hitler. He wins, but not in the first ballot. You essentially, the way most presidential elections work on the continent is everyone votes, and if no one gets over 50%, you get rid of the person who got the least votes, and then you see where their second preference went, etc., and then so on and so on. So someone's got 51% or above. He wins, but with a relatively unimpressive margin of 19 million to 13 million. So obviously, while that looks necessarily good because it's 6 million, Hindenburg does not see himself as only 1/3 better than his rivals, and therefore cause lots of problems. We can contend that this is kind of unreasonable on Hindenburg's sort of parts. How can he expect Bruning and punish Bruning for not making Hitler do something, knowing what Hitler's like, that he doesn't want to do? So this is a miscalculation of Hindenburg, and more Hindenburg's unreasonableness than anything else. He also, however, did something ridiculous, which was to antagonize Prussian nobility. The Prussian unity, obviously the Junkers, which Hindenburg is a very strong member, is surrounded by Junker friends and Junker advisors, etc., etc. The Junkers have been in massive financial straits for the reasons of the agricultural depression that we talked about previously. They have been therefore receiving state aid since 1928. So usually funding, as the food prices go down, extra money to keep them in their sort of semi-decent lifestyle. Bruning sets up a plan to break up the estates which have no chance of making money, either because they're so badly run, they're small, or they've got terrible land, whatever, and cut them up and give them to the unemployed, particularly into peasant small holdings. This is, as you can imagine, land reform and does not go down well. The Junkers argue that Bruning is a Hungarian Bolshevik, a clearly tendentious term, but again, they believe it. And Hindenburg forced his resignation of Bruning by essentially withdrawing Article 48 and demanding that he leaves. This government does not solve the problems. It is not popular. He had lost confidence from Schleicher, as mentioned, and therefore, because of this, Bruning is removed. So, as you can see here, the power base in the presidential government is Hindenburg, even if he isn't necessarily making the day-to-day decisions. So we now need to move on to what happens next. Hindenburg wants someone who's far more ideologically aligned to him, someone who's far more authoritarian. It's been 2 years of Bruning where his slightly authoritarian but mostly softy approach clearly has not worked, has not reduced the communist threat, has not reduced the depression, has not checked the Nazi growth, has not basically fixed Germany. And so he goes for someone a bit more like-minded. Franz von Papen is a Catholic, Centre Party, right-wing aristocrat. He has no real base in the Centre Party, however, because he is a local Prussian member of the Landtag who is on the far right of his party anyway. Okay, von Papen is seen as a puppet by Schleicher in particular. Schleicher thinks we want a more authoritarian regime. Authoritarian is far more traditional, and sees that the weak von Papen, or as he perceives the weak, easy to manipulate von Papen, as an ideal tool. Von Papen doesn't have a base in a party, doesn't have any power beyond being given the job by Hindenburg (Schleicher). Okay, Schleicher sees little Franz as a lightweight who will do what he's told. As we shall see, Schleicher is wrong on both counts, but the intention by appointing someone with such limited base in popular, particularly federal level politics, is to pick someone who is so dependent on doing what Hindenburg (Schleicher) wants. So, what happens under von Papen? So we first have the July 1932 elections. The SA had been banned along with Red Front by Bruning towards the end of his regime, something which only increased violence. The first thing Papen does is try and give an olive branch to the Nazis by unbanning the SA. This massively spikes in violence as the SA/SS, emboldened by their increasing ability to publicly wear uniforms, massively increase their fights with the Communist Red Front fighters. This will be important for a future lesson because we can say that this explosion of violence also increases the average German's fear that there is a communist uprising, or at least the threat of communist uprising is up. In this violence, over 100 are killed and 7,000 wounded. And in the election, the 1932 elections, the Nazis received 37.3% of the vote. We'll talk about why that is later, but we can say that the failure to deal with depression is definitely part of it. There is a problem with this. The Nazis are very reluctant to vote for any legislation which they do not control. With the Marxists getting about just under 20%, you now have 57.3% of parties who, aside from the DMVP, who are reduced to about 7 or 8%, who are reduced. The number of parties, sorry, that's about 60% of parties who do not subscribe to the conventional Reichstag support. There is no way in this electoral system that you are going therefore to get anything passed in the Reichstag, and therefore presidential government should continue. In fact, it probably legitimates presidential government more and encourages more authoritarianism because of the failure to deal with this otherwise. So, as they are the largest party in the Reichstag, they argued and they believed they had a mandate from the German people to be involved in the government. And they also saw their legitimacy increased by the fact that Papen and Schleicher were prepared to ignore the vast majority of SA and SS violence because it was targeted against the left. They saw it as a necessary evil. They didn't necessarily like the Nazis. None of these people trust the Nazis or even respect the Nazis. But they believe that it is helpful to have these goons go around, break up, and cause otherwise problems to the communists to stop them being a threat. We'll talk about that later, but this will be a key paragraph, which is fear of communism helps the Nazis come to power. So what's von Papen's plan? Well, you can already get a hint of it with the SA stuff, but in reality, von Papen is aiming, and Schleicher are aiming to try and co-opt the Nazis in. None of them respect Hitler. None of them like Hitler. Hindenburg famously described Hitler as that Austrian corporal. Corporal was the second most junior rank in the German army. However, they do see him as an idiot. Well, or a useful fool, someone able to be manipulated to bring his mass support to a dictatorial regime. And what the plan is, essentially, is that they will be in control. So the von Papen, Schleicher, Hindenburg, each one of them have a slightly different impression of who's going to be in control. They will be in control through the dominant groups of state, so the army, the civil service, the Junkers, basically the authoritarian elite, the DNVP elite, shall we say. But they will make a tactical alliance with the Nazis because the Nazis have the popularity, have the numbers. Now, you can say if the Nazis didn't have such a big vote, no one even consider bringing the Nazis in. But they decide that this is a good idea, that they can manipulate Hitler, and therefore they try and woo him. So, von Papen appoints a chunk of ministers, several from the DNP, many of which don't even have a role in government, and this becomes known as cabinet baron. Okay, as mentioned, they lift the ban on the SA. We'll talk about the Prussian state government in a second, and we have the elections, all of which are designed to woo the Nazis. They approach the Nazis, as we shall see, and ask them to try and join the government and bring a popular legitimacy, a popular percentage support to their essentially authoritarian government barons. Evidence of the extent to which von Papen and the presidential government have drifted from democratic values is shown in the Prussian state government. Now, Prussia is often seen as a very conservative region because of the East and the Junkers. Those people are. But in reality, Prussia also has most of the major industrial cities in Germany, or at least a number of them. And therefore, for example, Berlin, with a lot of people in it. So,
Dresden as well.
Dresden, thank you, Mr. Rain. And therefore, the working class vote is also quite high. And actually, therefore, when you look at the Landtag, the state government of Prussia, it is consistently dominated by a guy called Otto Braun and the SPD. Now, cannot stand. You cannot have the largest chunks of Germany with the largest share of the population essentially controlled with the SPD. And if you remember back to the first lesson, the federal government actually has a lot of control, the state government has a lot of control over the everyday lives of its people. So, using the pretext of the explosion of violence created by the unbanning of the SA, the state government dissolves the federal government dissolves the state government, dissolves the Landtag, and instead, by presidential decree, puts in a government ministers to run Prussia. There is no justification for this. You are essentially disenfranchising, removing the role of the power of someone's vote over their own affairs, the people of Prussia, of which that is the majority of Germany. The only argument behind this is ideological, and this should really show the intent and the anti-democratic ideas in von Papen and Schleicher and Hindenburg's approach. So, how does this plan go? Hitler quite savvily sees where the power lies, or you could argue pushes it without really much thought. Either way, he refuses to serve under von Papen and demands instead the chancellorship. We can argue in a future paragraph, for example, that Hitler's leadership skill is less about his ability to talk, but more about his ability to avoid being trapped by intrigue such as this. The idea was they'll give Hitler some token ministerial position, which doesn't really matter. He'll be happy with that because he thinks he's important, and go from there. So, he also demanded an enabling bill, the idea to give the Chancellor, who Hitler wants to be him, the right to pass Article 48 legislation. These demands are rejected outright by Hindenburg, who doesn't respect or trust Hitler, and doesn't see Hitler as having the democratic legitimacy with only 37% of the vote to demand such things. Whereas the idea that Hindenburg loves Hitler clearly can be shown that to be false here. What does Hitler do in retaliation? He orders his followers in the Reichstag to vote for a vote of no confidence against the current government under von Papen. Problem is, there's no one really in the Reichstag who supports von Papen because it's an anti. He has no base of support in the Reichstag. Yes, he's a member of the local centre party, but he's never really liked by them. And the vote of no confidence, according to the Constitution, necessitates new elections. Now, these elections are designed in Hitler's mind to get a greater democratic legitimacy through more votes. This backfires. The Nazis lose 4% of the vote, but still are the largest party, and continues the political stalemate because Hindenburg does not want to appoint Chancellor. But without him, you can't get a majority in the Reichstag. If you remember, the Nazis have 30%, but also the Marxists have 20%. There's no way you're getting a majority from anyone else. And the Nazis at any point could vote down any law that Schleicher wanted to get through. Okay, they could be voted down. Therefore, continuing the dependence on Article 48. In attempting to find a way out, after much of the intrigue and much of the whispering of Schleicher, who increasingly resents von Papen for being closer to Hindenburg than Schleicher. Schleicher is seen as a little bit of a jumped-up, sort of meritocratic nouveau riche man, where von Papen has the proper Prussian aristocratic sort of values that Hindenburg likes. Schleicher sort of intrigues to get von Papen fired because of this impasse. Okay. And Schleicher argues that he failed to get this stuff done. So let's have a quick chat about von Papen. He clearly has intents to destroy democracy. He comes forward during this period of plans to make himself dictator. Permanent suspension of the Reichstag, use of the army to suppress oppositions, and essentially a authoritarian state. This is what really pushes Schleicher to demand von Papen's resignation. Schleicher's getting a bit over his. Von Papen's getting a bit over his skis, little bit keen, a little bit out of control by Schleicher, and therefore Hindenburg is pressed to remove him, which Hindenburg does in December. So, who does Schleicher think should be next? Well, he tried his puppet mastery with Bruning. That didn't turn out well. With von Papen, that really didn't turn out well. He almost lost control of Hindenburg. You might notice throughout this, Hindenburg is quite a relatively passive figure. Well, Kurt von Schleicher. He has had this role throughout this whole period. Okay, he is best way to characterize Schleicher is he is someone who thinks he is very good at intrigue when actually he's not massively very good. He becomes Chancellor and he has this far-fetched scheme. He is going to create a new centre ground, or at least a new authoritarian consensus by rallying the trade unions and the socialist wing of the NSDAP under Stresser to join the government and split the NSDAP to render them weak. He will create this populist, working class-ish nationalist grouping that will support this authoritarian dictatorship. As you can imagine, the unions, who are strongly allied to the SPD or the KPD, strongly distrust Schleicher and massively that do not go in for this any way, shape or form. The split of the NSDAP does come closer. Strasser likes the idea of being vice-chancellor, and Strasser kind of has never massively liked Hitler because of his ideological division. And although this split comes closer, it's another testament to Hitler's skill as a leader that he manages to keep the party just together long enough to not take this bait. Strasser storms off. He will become the sort of opposition in exile, and then will basically be irrelevant for the rest of his course. Von Schleicher also increasingly gets the backstab in return from von Papen. Von Papen really does not like being intrigued by Schleicher, and so he starts immediately trying to form alliances with Hitler, discussions with Hitler, and get in Hindenburg's ear, because if you remember, Hindenburg would never really wanted to get rid of von Papen. He liked von Papen. Starts getting Hindenburg's ear to suggest that Schleicher is doing a bad plan, Schleicher doesn't know what he's doing, and that von Papen has the answer. Von Papen, partly is doing this for revenge, partly though he is also this new alliance with Hitler that he's proposing will give von Papen a continuing role in the state. Essentially, because of his abject failure, within just over a month, Schleicher is forced to resign because he can't do anything. His one play, this scheme to get this sort of populist, nationalist, socialist, but also supporting an authoritarian right-wing dictatorship idea just doesn't happen. So let's talk about Schleicher very briefly, although we'll do a lot more about these individual characters in our elite paragraph lesson later. He has been the most influential person in German politics for 3 years. He has consistently aimed to develop this authoritarian system where the traditional elites, the Junkers, the army, the civil servants, etc., were in control. Hindenburg, however, is increasingly unreliable and increasingly more likely to be swayed by von Papen. Hindenburg's increasing resentment towards von Schleicher, who's showing his inability to get stuff done, and also forced and cornered Hindenburg into getting rid of his friend von Papen. Von Papen's open disloyalty and willingness to advance the Nazis' cause in order to get back in power and get back at Schleicher, and the fact that the Reichswehr, the army itself, is growing impatient with Schleicher's intrigues, dragging the reputation of the army through the mud, for example, increasingly loses his base of support. However, arguably, one of the biggest causes of his failure is every time he has a design on the Nazis to do something or not do something, it does not happen. Initially, he designs to bring them in with Hitler. Hitler is too shrewd and too powerful over his own party to allow that to happen. And then when Schleicher tries to split the party in his gambit to get the left wing on his side, Hitler keeps control of his party, keeps control of the powerful Berlin wing of his party, and therefore avoids the split, again undermining Schleicher. So although Schleicher fails, there is a debate how far is this due to other factors von Papen and Hindenburg, but also Hitler's leadership, as it were. Either way, he is an abject failure and doesn't achieve very much in concrete terms as Chancellor. So then we have a problem. We have the resignation of Schleicher. Von Papen wants to come back into power, wants to get back at Schleicher, but also wants to come back in power. He proposes a deal. Hitler will be appointed Chancellor. And this takes a lot of persuading of Hindenburg, who is not massively keen on Hitler for reasons that we saw less than 6 months before. However, von Papen would serve as Vice-Chancellor. As you can imagine, this is on von Papen's suggestion/request. The cabinet would be filled with largely, and particularly the most important offices such as war, etc., that would be filled largely with reliable, conservative, non-Nazi men. Hindenburg would keep controlling Article 48, so if Adolf Hitler gets out of hand, Hindenburg could just withdraw the use of Article 48 and control, therefore, Hitler. And therefore, what this is essentially doing is, although Hitler is being put into chancellorship, he's being boxed in. He has von Papen as vice-chancellor to take over if Hitler is deposed. Von Papen is vice-chancellor, therefore will be present in most of the meetings, and therefore will be able to keep an eye on what Hitler is doing. They believe that they could tame Hitler to bring his populist support on side. And if worse comes to worse, Hitler can't do much damage in the majority of areas of state because most decisions about the army is taken by the war minister. Most of the decisions on foreign policy are taken by the foreign minister. None of these major ministerial offices are held by Nazis, and therefore. And finally, if worse is worse, he can withdraw Article 48, and Hitler only has 30% of the vote, cannot get things passed, and therefore he'll be forced to resign. This seems like a great plan, but you've got to question, why do they even entertain the idea? Well, number one, they're increasingly out of options. It's unclear, apart from full-on authoritarian dictatorship where you seize power with a coup in the street, there's not really anyone else who will be able to bring at least an allure of legitimacy, allure of we are actually doing what the people want. Apart from the Nazis. And what the Nazis are really doing, particularly considering the DNVP are also part of this quote-unquote coalition, is bringing the numbers, so although it's not 50%, it's close enough to look like a semi-legitimate thing. They are bringing the popular support, the popular sort of legitimacy to this presidential government. The idea you can see quite clearly, therefore, von Papen, Hindenburg will be the real powers. They will control everything. Hitler will just bring the mob to make it look legitimate. They will control him. To quote von Papen, we will have him in the corner so hard that he will start to squeak. And upon Hitler agreeing to this deal, von Papen's famous phrase, "We've hired him," the idea that that Hitler serves only at the will of Hindenburg and von Papen. So we move into the next phase. This is Hitler in power. Before we'll do a few video lessons on the different factors of how we got to this point, but then we move into the next phase. Hitler is in power. How does he go from this relatively weak position, no Article 48 power himself, complete dependence on Hindenburg, being watched by von Papen, no control over most of the cabinet, to a situation where he is the undisputed Führer of Germany? That, however, will be for a future lesson. Thank you very much. We'll start the next lesson by looking, I believe, at the elites, the first of the major paragraphs about why this happened. Until then, bye-bye.